All right, Catherine, I'm going to turn it over to you to give a presentation about the conceptual ecological models that have been developed for the science and adaptive management effort here in the program.
Okay, thank you so much, Debbie, and thank you, Laura. I feel really terrible that I have to follow Laura's talk because that was such a great discussion, and I feel like conceptual ecological models are a little bit of a downer after that. So I promise you I will not be talking for 30 minutes about conceptual ecological models, but I do think that they're an important tool for adaptive management, especially for this program, and I'd just like to share my thoughts on how we can move forward with them. So let me share my screen. Okay, can everybody see my PowerPoint? The dreaded green screen. Okay, so again, I'm going to be talking about conceptual ecological models, but this is going to be a very light talk. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with conceptual ecological models. Many of you have probably developed the ones for this program, and a few of you have probably written books or taught courses on the development of conceptual ecological models. So this is not going to be a comprehensive, wonky talk about the detailed development of any of these models, but it's just an overview of how we're going to use them for the program. And I'll give you some examples of the ones that were developed. All right, so why on earth do we want to use conceptual ecological models? Well, the collaborative program has 4 primary goals for using them to inform adaptive management, and they're here on the screen. The first and foremost that everyone is probably most familiar with is the identification of critical scientific uncertainties. So if a conceptual ecological model is an adequate or accurate representation of your knowledge about how a species or another biotic indicator interacts and responds to a set of environmental conditions, if that's your knowledge base, then inherently, if you're putting on paper what you know, then you will also be able to identify what you don't know. And so those become the uncertainties that we will then designate as either critical or not critical. And then the second reason the program wants to use these is making decisions with more transparency. So again, when you have a record of your knowledge base and how you identify uncertainties and then what you do with those uncertainties and then how you learn and improve the models over time, that lets everyone see what's going on. It kind of lets them peer in and see how the sausage is made. So it's a good way to get to number 3, which is effective communication. And so having a model which is a simplified version of reality, but at least gets down the important components. As Laura pointed out, it's a very powerful tool for bridging that communication gap between scientists and managers that so often exists. And then finally, number 4, this is from more of an administrative or programmatic sort of perspective, and very near and dear to my heart with my position on the program support team, is connecting management actions, system responses, and those guiding principles that I mentioned to you yesterday. That's what the little pyramid represents here. So being able to link all of those pieces of the puzzle is very important for that iterative learning that I mentioned about adaptive management. All right, what in the heck are conceptual ecological models? Like I said, most of you probably know this like the back of your hand, but for those of you who are not familiar with them, basically what it boils down to, of course, they can be much more complicated than this, but I'm just going to focus on the major components. You know, what are we talking about? And when you talk about conceptual ecological models, you're essentially talking about drivers, stresses, and responses. So what are drivers? They are factors that contribute to the success of a species or an assemblage or an ecosystem. So these models can represent different levels within an ecosystem. And whether you're talking about a species, an assemblage, a community, or an ecosystem, that's the response indicator. So you're looking for a change in that indicator. And then stressors are, on the flip side, stressors are factors that contribute to the failure of that biotic indicator. And so in this box, I've shown you some very, very simplified things that I think are important ways to think about stressors. And you can think of them as being either natural or anthropogenic or man-made. The exposure of the indicator to the stressor can be either acute or chronic. And then the idea of this tolerance threshold, the idea here is that a little bit of exposure to a stressor is tolerable by most organisms. If it wasn't, we'd all be dead. so of course, life is very resilient, and there's a little bit of a stress is okay. And then, of course, there are some stressors that a little bit of exposure to that is actually beneficial to the biotic response. But there exists usually some threshold above which that stressor becomes detrimental to the indicator. So just keeping that in mind, that a little bit is okay usually, not for all stressors, but for most things that occur in nature. And then finally, again, as Laura pointed out, being comfortable with uncertainty. Uncertainty is always going to exist, but for our purposes, we want to always try to reduce it if we can. But know that in ecology, you're always going to be uncertain. There is no black or white issue in ecology. Because there's always multiple factors at work. So being okay with that and still moving forward is really where we're trying to go with adaptive management. All right, so how do we use conceptual ecological models? So if you think about these CEMs as non-quantitative planning tools that are identifying those drivers, stressors, and the ecological responses, and then figuring out what is the best biological attribute or indicator of that response. So we just talked about what a response is. It's a measurable change in some kind of indicator, but how do you know what to measure that's going to show you a response to that stressor? And figuring that out is actually one of the most challenging parts of this process. Some people think it's rather straightforward. Oh, you just count how many fish, or count how many bird nests or something like that. It's not always that simple and straightforward. And sometimes you're trying to, and it depends on the level of response that you're trying to capture. Again, at the species level all the way up to the ecosystem, finding the right indicator or attribute to measure is rule number one on successful use of these models. So, and you can think, I really like this definition. I found this, I believe it was in a USGS document. And I love this definition of how you use these models. You can think of it as a progression of scientific thought, where you start with determining the key ecological components. So all the little pieces, the boxes that you're going to put in that conceptual model. And then over time, figuring out how they all fit together, how they all relate to one another. And you summarize the causal mechanisms and relationships among all those variables at the end. So I like that sort of bridge. Okay, so I think of conceptual ecological models for the purposes of adaptive management for this program as sort of the engines of science. So if the conceptual ecological model itself is, as I said, an adequate representation of what you know about how a system works, then again, you can pull out those uncertainties because it should be obvious what you don't know. Now, whether or not that uncertainty is reducible determines what you do with it next, because some uncertainties are just not knowable. Sometimes it's just some life history characteristic or some mystery of nature that you cannot design a study or a research question hypothesis to figure out. It's some things you just can't know, and usually those are what we call stochastic. So it's just, you know, variability that occurs in nature that is just part of life, and really there's no way to design an experiment to reduce that down. So being comfortable with that and being able to identify it is very important. But knowing which uncertainties are not reducible, if you can think about it, is very, very important to how you treat that conceptual ecological model, because you'll want to stay away from those things. They're always going to exist. It's always going to be a question mark in your conceptual ecological model, but you don't have to waste time and resources on them. So it's going to affect how you organize your thoughts with those conceptual ecological models. And that's what I was trying to represent with the green arrow here. But if an uncertainty is in fact reducible, and it's something that you can figure out through the scientific method, then you can use it to translate that uncertainty into a research hypothesis, and then design a study to an experiment to test that hypothesis. And at this point, if your study is not purely descriptive, so you're not just trying to fill in a gap about the life history of a species, if you actually have an experiment, a field experiment, or some other format that you'd like to do, then this is the point at which you can bring in management alternatives. And this is key to adaptive management, obviously. And because this is where you can really start testing things, and if you have the ability to change things in the environment using the tools of management, then you can see what the results are. And then the final arrow there is whatever you learned goes back in and actually informs and improves that conceptual ecological model. So it closes the loop here and is really an engine for science and adaptive management. And of course, you've already seen this process, because Shay Howland pointed out that this is how we're encapsulating this process in the adaptive management database that we're putting together. And that pathway that I just showed you is represented, highlighted in yellow here. So, so we're really excited about being able to take these things that are sort of hypothetical or theoretical and actually input them into the database and link them up so that we can start using them to inform our long-term planning and prioritization process. All right, so of course we have 5 species that we deal with in this program. And unfortunately, we do not have conceptual ecological models developed for all 5 species, but we are in different stages of development for each one. For the cuckoo and the flycatcher here, the science work groups, they developed those conceptual ecological models in tandem because the life history of the birds is so similar. So I'll show you those models in a second. And they're at the life stage model level right now. They have not taken those individual life stage schematics and integrated them into one complete model just yet, but we will get there eventually. For the Rio Grande silvery minnow, they're a little bit further along in the process, but not finished yet. So I'll show you some of the different variations of how the conceptual ecological model for the minnow is represented in just a second. But there's still a lot of work to be done, even though there's more known about the minnow. There's a lot of missing linkages, I believe, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. For the New Mexico meadow jumping mouse and the Pecos sunflower, we will be developing, there's a lot of uncertainty around those species' life history. So we invite input. If you guys want to work on that, please give us a call, and we can either do a workshop or just have a series of meetings about putting those things together. I believe those conceptual ecological models will probably be built around critical habitat. That's where I see that going. Whoops. Okay, so for the avian species, like I said, the conceptual ecological models for the swiffle and the cuckoo were developed in tandem around the life cycles because both birds are neotropical migratory songbirds. Much uncertainty still exists in both species' life history, so a lot of the work that will be done and generated from these conceptual ecological models will be descriptive. like I mentioned earlier. And hopefully eventually down the road, we'll get into bringing in some of those management alternatives and looking at what we can do in the floodplain to benefit those species. And these knowledge gaps, this uncertainty in the life history must be addressed before relationships among the variables can be represented in the amount of detail that we've done with the silvery minnow. It doesn't mean that we can't stop. There'll just be a lot of question marks. Okay, so for both bird species, this is the general life cycle representation, and so this was the starting place, and I'll show you that an individual conceptual model was developed for each of these stages. Some of them were combined, but each of these stages for each species. All right, so this is what the models look like for the birds, and it's a very different way of looking at it than was used for the silvery minnow. And so I'll just this is just a legend here. I'll show you sort of what the schematic means. So the conceptual ecological models for each life stage are represented as a bullseye that's divided into wedges, and each wedge represents either a driver in green or a stressor in red. And then the circles indicate the level of importance from low, medium to high. And the hash marks indicate the ability to manage that particular driver or stressor. Any question marks you see will represent uncertainty and the level of uncertainty for that level of importance for each wedge. So here's an example for the southwestern willow flycatcher for the territory and pair selection life stage. And you can see that sort of there's a lot known about the drivers in green here, and there's still some uncertainty, but it's nice to be able to identify where that uncertainty exists and what level it exists on, and you can kind of see how being able to manage these different drivers and stressors is important in a visual representation. And just for comparison, here's another one for the yellow-billed cuckoo for nestlings and juveniles. And you can see there's a lot more, looks like a lot more stressors listed here, but also some uncertainties. So filling in those question mark areas and being able to identify what are the most important things that we need to focus on will help with prioritization. Okay, so moving on to the conceptual ecological model for the Rio Grande silvery minnow. This spiral schematic here is sort of where it's the big picture conceptual model for the minnow, and it's also a life cycle based model, and so the transitions between each of the life stages, there's 5 of them. For each of those transitions, a separate transition schematic was developed by the work group that worked on the silvery minnow model, and this one depicts the transition from adults to age 2 and beyond, and so that's this transition right here in the middle. So it's out of the loop, and what they've done is indicated the transition as a probability of survival, and then put down all the drivers and stressors, and then how, like the importance, the level of importance, the level of relevance to management, and the level of uncertainty. So that's what's represented by the different color and different thickness arrows. And so there's 5 of these transition schematics that were developed. And then those transition schematics were used to figure out the different components for the integrated model. And I'm going to show you that in a second. So in the integrated model, you have basically 4 different types of components. Will represent the life stage, will represent that transition probability, usually survival. All the different environmental factors, these are the drivers and stressors, and then any management. And we're still in the process of including these management elements in the model. And then, of course, the different color and different thickness arrows represent the levels of understanding, the direction of the relationship, and the level of uncertainty. And then all of the various environmental components were then grouped by type. And these were used to sort of color code the model and make it a little bit easier on the eyes. All right, so this is the very unpopular graphical representation of the integrated model. And the cool thing about this is it's a very quick way to represent all of the various elements that are included in the different transition schematics. I have gotten very negative feedback about this graphic. However, I will keep plugging it, and I'll show you why in a second. But if you want to, the reason I like this model is if you want to focus on one particular transition probability, such as adult survival, you can do that and pull out just the elements that are connected to that, that particular probability. And so it instantly shows you, okay, these are all the different things that are affecting this one piece that I'm interested in looking at. Another way of, another way of looking at this is in a tabular format. And so we've also developed what we call a relationship matrix. So it just takes that same information and puts it in a matrix format so that you can easily go in and look at relationships and color code them by level of uncertainty or importance. And it's just a very quick way to reference what relationships exist in the integrated model. It's also a way to get at incorporating it into the adaptive management database, which we're going to do with all of these conceptual models eventually. Now, again, if you do not like the way this looks, I will direct you to the conceptual ecological models that have been developed for other species, and they are much more complicated. So even though this looks bad, it is not as bad as it could be, trust me. And we are actually working to complicate this a little bit more because, just for an example, the genetic components are obviously here they're lacking. So I've asked some folks to give me input on how we can expand that particular aspect of this model and create more linkages that make more sense to reality. So that is going to get a lot of attention this next year. But again, if you don't like this, check out the one for the pallid sturgeon. So this is the conceptual ecological model schematic for one life stage of pallid sturgeon in the Missouri River. And so there's multiple iterations of this. And I found another one from the lower Colorado for the razorback sucker. Again, this is one life stage. So these things are complex, and I don't want people to get hung up on how this graphical model looks. It is used to represent information in a different way, and it's going to be very helpful to inputting these complex relationships into our adaptive management database so that we can link them up with other elements. So finally, that's what this is all about. You know, the reason I wanted to talk to you guys about these models is we don't want them to sit on a shelf and languish. We want them to live and be constantly improved and be informative, be used as tools of adaptive management. And so what are the next steps moving forward? Again, all of the different models are in various stages of development, but we continue to need to characterize the uncertainties that exist, figure out if they're reducible or not, figure out if the studies that need to be designed are descriptive or testable hypotheses, because it's very different approaches. Figure out for the uncertainties themselves, we need to figure out the magnitude of their importance and their influence and relevance to the different species. And then, like I said, we're going to work on incorporating these in tabular format into the database, which is a little bit of a challenge, but it just takes some time. And then, of course, linking them to hypotheses and getting them working in that, that generation of scientific studies. Most important to most of you is probably going to be prioritization of uncertainties. And for that, under the new Science and Adaptive Management Plan, we're actually going to be doing a top-down approach. So it's going to be using those guiding principles that I talked about in the blue pyramid, working first from the program's mission, then to the goals, then to objectives that we're going to be working on in an objectives workshop in either January or February. I'd like all of you to participate in that. And then below that is the strategies, which are the methods and resources that are needed to implement, to reach those objectives. And then I just like to talk about objectives being SMART. For those of you who aren't familiar with SMART objectives, they are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So when you put those parameters on an objective, objectives are supposed to be measurable. So you need to define how you're going to measure it, what you're going to measure, in what time frame, and make sure that it's something that's attainable. That's a way to set yourself up for success. In terms of prioritizing uncertainties, this will help with the program's short and long-term planning. And we have a long-term plan that we're going to be working on coming out. We have version 1, and then we'll have version 2 next year that should line all these things up with, again, with those guiding principles in a way that serves our immediate needs as well as looking into the future. And then finally, I just want to mention once again the importance of uncertainty. Conceptual ecological models are never finished. They can always improve over time, and hopefully if they are living things, if they're the central part of your knowledge of how the system works, they will constantly be improved. So I don't want these things to sit on a shelf or in some sort of server somewhere and not get used. If you saw something in today's models that you don't like, call us up and we'll do a workshop, and you can get in there and make your points known, because if you know something that we can use to improve these models, then that's what we need to do with these. So with that, I'll take any thoughts unless we are running short of time.